The radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. The radical. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Tuesday, January 11th. We're well into 2022. I hope you're having a fantastic year so far and having a good week. And I think we've got an interesting show today. We're going to tackle a big topic, which is the relationship between capitalism and slavery. We're going to analyze a little bit a video of Sam Seder's a discussion about capitalism and slavery that he had. Would the U.S. exist today if not for slavery? And so we'll talk. We'll go over that video a little bit. I was a little disappointed in the video because his guest turned out to be much more reasonable than Sam Seder is, and diffused a lot of it. But I did a lot of reading about this issue, so I'll bring up a lot of the points that Sam Seder would have brought up, wanted to bring up, that the people he's had on the show in the past have brought up. There's a whole school of thought that connects slavery and capitalism. We'll talk about the issues they bring up and why they are wrong, and why I call BS on the whole claim that slavery set up American capitalism and it's the only reason we're rich today, which is Sam Seder's opinion. If you remember, when I was on Sam Seder's show, they kept bringing that up. His co-host kept bringing that up. What about slavery? Capitalism wouldn't exist without slavery. And I knocked that down, but they keep at it. You know, this is a huge issue for them. It's one of their main debate points about the evils of capitalism is to relate it to slavery. And of course, it's all linked to the 1619 Project of the New York Times and the left's agenda for education. And it's all linked to basically to the rewriting of history to make the U.S. seem and capitalism in particular seem like an evil institution. So, all right, so we're going to talk about that. That's going to be the whole show. There's a lot of content there. There's a lot of stuff to go through. All right, remind you that on Thursday the show will be about. Show will take a similar analysis perspective on a video from Tucker Carlson. This one about population growth, so we'll see exactly where that goes. It's not a particularly intellectual question. Tucker's not much on the intellectual side, but it'll be interesting. So as I said, I will be bouncing between Tucker Carlson and Sam Seder in the future to make sure that we have balance in the show and we are showing the BS on both sides of the aisle. The BS from Sam is more intellectual than the BS from Tucker, but they're both BS, so we're going to call them on it. Let's see what else, other announcements quickly. Don't forget, Super Chat, questions answered here. $20 questions get priority. $20 questions also get us to a goal of $600 much faster. When was it? Sunday, we completely tanked on the Super Chat after a string of unbelievable Super Chats where we blew out of the water our goals. We kind of ground to a halt completely on Sunday. So hopefully we can revive the Super Chat. We can get it going again, and you guys can increase your support of the Yaron Brook Show. We're going to be doing a lot more of these commentary videos. We're going to be doing a lot more, doing at least 4 videos a week. And other than when I travel, we're going to be doing a lot of stuff. And you make it possible by supporting the show. So thank you to all the Super Chatters. Thank you to the monthly contributors at yaronbrookshow.com/support, Patreon and subscribe to. And then thank you, Jonathan Honing, for getting the Super Chat going. And hopefully we'll get some questions. I'm not sure what's going on. I guess you guys have just run out of questions or run out of money. It could be you run out of both. All right. So as I was saying, a big issue on the left, and really going back to Marx, because Marx made this claim. Marx made the claim that American capitalism was based on the profits achieved from the cotton industry in the South, during slavery. So in a sense, the capitalism in the United States, at least, was financed on the backs of slaves. That the capital was generated. The capital was generated off of the backs of slaves, and then that capital was then invested, and that is what created modern American capitalism. Now, we'll get to some of those claims as we go along, but that claim is being resurrected in the United States by a new school of economic historical thought. This is a school that is claiming to integrate both economics and history to study the founding of America, the economics and history of pre-founding, the economics and history of post-founding. And a big chunk, a big central focus of the literature coming out of the school, is its critique of capitalism, its attack on capitalism, and its view that capitalism in the United States could not have existed if not for slavery, and indeed, slavery was a feature of capitalism. There would be no capitalism without slavery, and it was a feature of it, and it made it possible. This is the new, what do they call themselves? I have it here. We will find it. God. Anyway, we will get to it. But that's the basis, right? Karl Marx, just to give you the quote, 1847, he wrote, "Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will wiped out America off the map of nations." So according to Karl Marx, without slavery, there would be no America. And of course, 1619 Project has picked that up. The founding of America, according to 1619 Project, is not 1776. It's 1619, the introduction of slavery into the Americas, because slavery is such a big part of American history, of what it means to be an American, on the definition of America. Now, let me just say that I relied on a lot of, let me just find this anyway. Yeah, that's 1619. I relied on a lot of the work, kind of the reading about this on Phil Magnus at the American Institute for Economic Research. American Institute for Economic Research is a PhD that does a lot of economic history. He specializes on these questions around slavery and around the economic history of the United States, and it has spent a lot of time debunking a lot of the stuff that is coming out from these new historians / economists, and debunking the 1619 Project. Now, I will say that these people call themselves historian and economists, but as you'll see, they are neither historians nor economists. They get their history wrong. They get their economics wrong. They would get the economic history wrong. They're just ridiculous. So thank you, Phil Magnus, who does an excellent job at debunking the 1619 nonsense and really, really bad stuff that comes out of it. All right, so let's jump into the video. And then once the video is over, we are going to kind of examine some of the broader allegations, some of the broader claims. Ashton, thank you. Really appreciate that. Even Ashton doesn't have a question. It's just $50 out there, but I'm telling you, you guys have run out of questions. It's interesting. All right, let's jump in. Let me just go find the video. There it is. Let me switch to this. You see, that's the panel. This guy's called, his name is Jonathan Levy. He's written books. I've skipped to minute 6:32 out of this 12-minute video to a large extent because nothing much has been said that is controversial. I mean, what Jonathan Levy is saying up until this point is, look, the British in the 17th century and in the 18th century viewed commerce as central. The crown basically guided commerce. War was a big motivation around this. And the crown basically established slavery as a commercial activity. All of this is consistent with what? Well, not with capitalism. None of this is capitalism because everything is guided by government. Central planning is not, even if done by a king, is not capitalism. All of this is consistent with, indeed, the economic system with which slavery is 100% consistent. And it is the economic system that the champion of capitalism, one of the original champions of capitalism as an economic system, Adam Smith, spoke out against. What was the economic system that he spoke out against? It was mercantilism. So all that comes out of the first 6 minutes or so of this video is that in spite of what Sam is trying to guide him towards, in spite of what Emma is trying to ask leading questions, Jonathan keeps basically saying, without using these words, yeah, slavery is a phenomena of statism. Slavery is a phenomena of mercantilism. Slavery is a phenomena of state power. That's not controversial. That I agree with completely. The idea, though, that slavery sets up capitalism is what we're going to get to now. So Sam is frustrated. Sam is like, he wants this guy to say slavery is capitalism. And Jonathan's not doing it. Now, I don't know Jonathan's politics. My guess is that I would disagree with Jonathan about a lot of things. But he comes across as at least trying to be somewhat objective, trying to be somewhat honest, and not just BSing in order to appease Sam. Now, he says things here that I think are wrong, but you can tell the difference between him and Sam. And you can tell that Sam is getting frustrated. This is not what Sam wants. He's not giving it to him. Like his other guests on this topic all fed Sam with all this information that was consistent with his priors, with his belief about the evil of capitalism, and particularly American capitalism. And capitalism here, I'm using in a very loose term. We're using it to denote generally the system of free markets. We'll get later to a better definition of capitalism and then what that means for this entire debate. But just for the purposes of how they're talking, loose term, free markets, freedom, freedom to trade, no government intervention in the economy or very little government intervention in the economy. That's generally what capitalism means to them. All right, let's see. So let's play this. This is Sam. Jonathan has just laid out kind of the statist, mercantilist perspective of history of what was going on in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And this is Sam asking him the next question. Whoops. Oh, clicking in the wrong place.
Yes.
Do you think that American capitalism, to the extent that we're telling the story of capitalism, could it have existed without slavery? I mean, could it have been born without it? I mean, again, it's sort of like this dynamic with my daughter. She very well may go on to sort of...
The story of his daughter is that he bought his daughter clothes, and now she's selling the clothes that he bought her. So he's using that as a metaphor for slavery being the basis, and now he's saying the daughter is going to build an empire off of the clothes that he bought her, and she might get some money and buy more clothes. But the seed capital, the seed for entire business, was the clothes that he gave her. That's a metaphor for slavery is at the beginning. The capitalists didn't earn anything. It was the slaves, and they just exploited the capital they produced there in order to create the system of capitalism. So that's what the story is. He started out the video with the story about the daughter. So just filling you in.
Sell the jeans that I got her for, enough money that she can then buy 2 other pieces of clothing and build her clothing empire. But if it wasn't for me buying those jeans in the first place, she would not be able to get this thing started. Could capitalism have worked without that level of exploitation of basically free stuff to begin with? I mean, it's sort of like, I don't know. Could Donald Trump have $1 to his name right now if he didn't get that money from his dad, or however you want?
The math suggests no, since I think if he just put it in an index fund, he would have had more. Right.
But
I think the answer to the last question is definitely no. I think the earlier questions are a bit more complicated. I mean, in the abstract.
I mean, I give him credit for at least saying that the question's a little bit more complicated. So he's not some ideologue who's out to get capitalism in the sense of to get the system and to link it to slavery. He's going to link it a little bit, but he's not quite, I think that Sam Seder, usual guest, is just going to plow ahead with this lead opening that Sam has given him. So he's going to try to be a little nuanced here.
Sure. I think we're talking about capitalism. We have to talk about capitalism in the plural. So certainly we know that there can be capitalisms without slave labor. We've had one
Sam's
since
not
the Civil
happy.
War, in this country.
But
With that said, I mean, go ahead.
But I mean, everything that we had, we got to the point where that slavery, and I don't know, and I guess this is a subsidiary question that I want to ask. Could we have seen the growth of industrial capitalism that really is the next era that you're talking about without that slavery, even in the North? I mean, wasn't it the ability of generating this labor intensive commodity, ultimately cotton, that you could not have made as profitable and as commodified, I guess, were it not for the fact that we just don't have to pay for the part to really make it on some level.
Yeah, I mean, these are old, important debates in economic history. Some have argued that profits from slavery, directly led to investments in early industrialization. Those arguments, those kind of direct connections, right, haven't held up as well.
Haven't held up as well. So he's pushing back against Sam. They haven't held up as well. Oh my God, Sam, what are we going to do? Now, that's an understatement. They haven't held up, period. There is no direct connection. Cotton trade was a small fragment of the American economy. Now, one of these economists of this new school of economics did some math where he took the total worth of cotton produced in a year, and then he took every intermediary step in the creation of that cotton, and he added it all up, the transportation and the manufacturing and the shipping and every step along the way, from the picking all the way to the final good. And he added it all up, and he said, well, this was 50% of GDP in the United States. But of course, that's not how you measure GDP. He's comparing apples to oranges. The only part that's captured in GDP is the value of the final product. So cotton was about 5%, not insignificant. A significant portion of the US economy was cotton. When the country was founded in 1776, cotton was insignificant. Very little export of cotton. It's only with the invention of the cotton gin, it's only in the 1790s that cotton starts to become a real important product. It's only in the early 19th century that we start exporting huge amounts of cotton to the United Kingdom. And a lot of that, most of that, has to do not with slavery, but with what? Has to do with technology. It has to do with the fact that, let's see, it had to do with the fact that we were developing better types of cotton, that we were, that the cotton gin had been invented, that there was actually innovation and ingenuity happening that made cotton valuable. And indeed, it's true that slaves produced cotton, but that doesn't mean that Slaves were essential for the production of cotton, or indeed a productive, the best productive way to produce the cotton. It's fascinating that in 1870, so there was a decline after the Civil War, there was a decline in cotton production because of the disruption of the Civil War, and everybody had gone to war, people had died. It took a while to get things ramped up. But by 1870, freedmen, both blacks and whites, produced as much cotton in the South as the South had produced from slave labor in 1860. So it's not slavery that made cotton production. And indeed, you could argue, right? You could argue that more cotton would have been produced if they hadn't used slave labor. Slave labor is known to be not very productive, quite expensive, and not profitable from an economic perspective, profitable for the slave owner. But an economy of the South based on slavery was actually an unproductive, inefficient economy. The U.S., the South, would have been far richer if it had never had slave labor. Not poorer. I mean, he's making an argument that they would have been poorer, right? That they benefited from slavery, that slavery was some kind of zero cost or profit venture. That they exploited, and they did exploit. They exploited labor, and they did. But all the value of that exploitation went to a few rich slave owners. But economically, from an economic perspective, it was a drag on economic growth, not an accelerative economic growth. And even when it comes to cotton, as I said, by 1870, freemen were producing just as much cotton as slaves were in 1860. In India, in Southwest China, in Egypt, cotton was produced by non-slaves. Cotton was not, in order to be profitable, did not necessitate slavery. These economists claim that, but slaves are cheap labor. They're much cheaper. But it turns out that a Nobel Prize economist, Robert Fogel, in 1974, wrote this paper that showed that productivity was incorporated into the market price of a slave. So you paid for that up front. It's how any capital market works. You pay for the expected productivity of what you're buying. If you bought a slave, you face the cost of alternative uses of capital. You could have used that capital to do something else, employ people, invest in technology, invest in, other things other than cotton potentially. There was no supernormal profits accrued from the purchase. Slave labor was not a free lunch, and wealth did not just pile up. On the contrary. So the share of slaves in U.S. wealth has been grossly exaggerated. It's far less than what it had been claimed before. And the fact is that most of the increase in the production of cotton was not a consequence of more slaves, but was a consequence of increased productivity that resulted from technology. Right? So slavery was appalling. The victims of the slavery are the slaves. The, quote, benefactors of slavery are the slave owners. But the economy didn't get better because of slavery. It got worse because of slavery. Prosperity didn't depend on slavery. The United States and the United Kingdom and the rest of the world would have been just as rich, actually probably richer, without 250 years of unrequited of slavery. And they remain rich in spite of the fact that slavery is gone from the world. Right? All right. So let's see how Jonathan Levy deals with some of this.
But I still think a weaker version of the same argument, which you're suggesting, has to be true, in the sense that without slavery,
Sam's not happy.
The commercial history of the United States would have been greatly diminished. Greatly diminished.
Really? How would it have been greatly diminished? Again, slaves are less productive than free labor, as history suggests, as economic theory suggests, as if you understand anything about human psychology and human motivation suggests.
Would that have meant that capitalism never would have come about? I don't know if I go, that far. It's an interesting counterfactual question, but we can definitely look at what did happen and say that slavery was very important to early American economic development. I think that changes over time. I think it's much more important earlier in this period. I think by the time you're in the 1840s and 1850s, you're seeing industrial capitalism develop in the North, which starts to look different. Now, and then I'll just say one more.
It's very different. And indeed, that industrial capitalism in the North is where the real wealth was being produced. It's where immigrants were coming in. Immigrants didn't go to the South. They went north. It's where jobs were being created. It's where real sustainable wealth was being produced. It's why during the Civil War, the North was so much richer than the South. It was because of this manufacturing capitalism. It was because of non-slave dependent capitalism, free capitalism, that the North flourished as much as it did, whereas the South stagnated. So it's just not true that the commercial history of the United States depends on slavery in any way, shape, or form.
One more thing, slavery is the most awful form of coerced labor, but coerced labor.
Absolutely.
So even when capitalism doesn't depend on slavery as such, it still oftentimes depends upon or draws from coercion of labor, and that's something we have to be mindful of.
But coercion of labor is never capitalism. Capitalism is the exact opposite. Capitalism is voluntary labor. It's not coerced labor. And they're trying to make, and they do, the left does this all the time, trying to make this implication that voluntary labor is equivalent to coerced labor. And that's just absolute travesty and absolute evil to make that comparison. All right, let's keep going.
Across periods.
Before we get into this next period, let me just ask you one more question too. How the Louisiana Purchase, and in particular the Haitian Revolution, plays into this. I mean, as a factor in changing the course of capitalism as we head towards this next era.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a very specific point, which is that without the revolution in Haiti, very likely Napoleon doesn't decide to sell Louisiana to the United States, and so that's a very significant. Second, I argue in the book that despite the American Revolution, it's very important, but it's not much of a discontinuity in the book. It's in the middle of the same age as I have it, and that actually what the Louisiana Purchase does for the United States is it means that the United States kind of looks like the 18th century British Empire. Instead of having slave colonies in the Caribbean with an industrial metropole in the north, and then provisioning from Northeast colonial America at the time, instead we have this very thriving plantation complex rooted in cotton that emerges out of Louisiana, that's connected commercially to the rise of Chicago, cities like that in the Midwest that focused on grain, that focused on food, that focused on provisions, and then industrialization in the Northeast.
I mean, this idea that Chicago rose because of slavery, that Chicago, that the whole provision of food and grain is all about slavery. Weren't there people in the North? Weren't there people in the West? Weren't there people in the South who were not slaves? Did they not need food? If there was no slavery, would there be no grain industry? Would there be no food production? Would there be no agriculture? Would there be none of this? I mean, it is such a it's such a bogus argument that these people make. They take history and they can't think beyond the direct relationships that they see, right? Slaves, food goes to slave. Oh, you see, they made money off of the food that went to the slaves. So there's another industry making money off of slavery. But if the slaves were free men, they'd still be eating. The industry that produces food is not dependent on slavery, it's dependent on people, but not on slavery qua slavery. The only people who got rich off of slaves are the slave owners and the slave traders, the people who brought them over from Africa and traded them. But it's they look for anything to undermine capitalism, anything to undercut it, anything to portray it in the worst, most ugly, darkest light. Their motivation is not history. Their motivation is not to understand economics. Now, again, Levy, I think, is a little bit more honest than most of them, but the motivation of most of these 1619 authors is they start with the premise: capitalism is evil. Capitalism was established on the backs of slaves. Now, let's go and figure out how we can manipulate the numbers and manipulate the history and find links and connections and do everything we can to abandon economic theory, to abandon economics generally, just in order to show that this is all true, that this must have happened. So let's go over some of the arguments that they make. Let me start by the fact that they never define capitalism. They never define capitalism because they don't want to put capitalism into a box, to have a definition, to be clear, and then have to say, well, this isn't exactly capitalism and this doesn't fit. Capitalism is what they don't like. Capitalism is that which brought about the evils that they identify in American society today and in American history. It doesn't help them to define capitalism. You can define it badly because then they're stuck. They're stuck with a particular view of capitalism. So they never define it. Because if you define capitalism as the system of individual rights, if you define capitalism as a system where there's separation of state from economics, and if you define capitalism as a system where the sole role of government is the protection of individual rights, where it's separate from the economy, and where all property is privately owned, then slavery is inconsistent with capitalism. And most of what they complain about in terms of what the state does is inconsistent with capitalism. And we don't live in a capitalist country today, so they have to complain about the mixed economy, which is not as interesting as if they could just blame every bad thing that exists out there on capitalism. Let's look at some of the specific claims that they make. So, for example, there's a claim that these historians make. Some of this is ridiculous, so, bear with me, but this is things they actually claim. Double-entry bookkeeping was established as a means of doing business by slavery. The slave owners had a very sophisticated accounting, depreciation, double-entry bookkeeping, the whole shebang. Right. Now, this is bizarre. Because if you know anything about history, you know the double-entry bookkeeping was introduced into Europe in Italy in the Renaissance. And indeed, the double-entry bookkeeping was first used by the Arabs in the Ottoman Empire, and the Italians got it from North Africa. And the double-entry bookkeeping was used by the Medicis. It was used by businesses in Europe through the Renaissance and onwards. Slave owners didn't invent double-entry bookkeeping. It's just bizarre, right? Let me just find this. Accounting, American business started using double entry bookkeeping around the middle part of the 19th century. Had nothing to do with slavery. And if there'd not been slavery in America, would they have never brought in double entry bookkeeping from Europe? I mean, it's just weird, right? That they would even come up with something like depreciation. Depreciation accounting, was used in the North, in growth industries that employed expensive and long-lived assets. Railroads used depreciation. It wasn't started by slave owners. It was much more useful and much more engaged with in the industrial North than it was in slave-owning South. So, no way. Futures markets, they claim. Cotton is a commodity. Prices can go up and down. So they started to have futures markets and different forms of financial markets that would insure cotton. This is all made up. And of course, so it's slavery and cotton industry in the United States is what led to a thriving financial markets, the Chicago Board of Trade, the future markets in Chicago, all of that is somehow a creation of the cotton market. But that's just factually, historically nonsense. I mean, literally, these historians make stuff up. I mean, the first official exchange, futures exchange, was called the Royal Exchange. It was established in 1570, 46 years before Jamestown's settlement in 1619. A foremost futures market was established in Japan in the late 1600s for rice. In America, the first futures market was written in 1851 in the North, in Chicago, and it had nothing to do with cotton. Futures contracts in Chicago were overwhelmingly contracts in wheat, corn, barley, rye, oat, not cotton. They literally make stuff up. And this is the challenge you have as a defender of capitalism. The challenge is that the other side just invents history. They lie. Or they're so incompetent they don't know they're inventing it. I guess that's a possibility. But this has been pointed out. Writers have written about this. Phil Magnus is just one of them, but some well-known economists have written about it. Right? For example, this idea of depreciation in industry in the North, Brazel, Warren, and Walsh wrote a paper about this. There are plenty of papers showing that this new school, they call themselves the New History of Capitalism School, is just not true. Nonsense. As part of this, they make the claim, for example, that modern capital markets were a result of slavery. Again, a result of cotton. Right? But securitizations were used by land companies in early 1700s America, had nothing to do with slavery or cotton. Right? And again, what about financial markets in Holland? What about financial markets in the UK? It's just, again, made up stuff. Financial markets first started going global in the late 1600s. And that's true of mobility. Again, I told you before about making up the idea that cotton was at the core of the entire American economy. This is a book by Baptiste that is just complete nonsense. As other authors have written, quote, Baptiste's study of capitalism and slavery is flawed beyond repair. All in all, Baptiste's arguments on the sources of slave productivity growth and on the essentiality of slavery for the rise of capitalism have little historical foundation, raise bewildering and unanswered contradictions, selectively ignore contradicting evidence, and are error-ridden. GDP growth in the United States actually accelerated after the war. Why did real GDP per capita grow after the war? Not GDP growth, because GDP growth is influenced by immigration. GDP per capita accelerates after the Civil War. I mean, there's a period in which there's a recession. I mean, you'd expect after a war like that. But then it just takes off in the 1870s and 1880s. Why? Because of capitalism, because of freedom, because of innovation. Not because of capital from slavery. The North was already much richer than the South. Cotton was never a significant source. Indeed, people have run these regressions where they compare the percent of the population that were slaves relative to per capita GDP. And they show an inverse relationship. The more slaves, the lower the GDP. The fewer slaves, the higher the GDP. And this is, by the way, hundreds of years later. That is true. Hundreds of years later, 200 years later, it's still true. It's still true today. And you can do the same thing on states. States that had no slavery are generally richer than slaves that had a lot of slaves, like Mississippi and South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama. They're the poorest states. The richer states, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, New York, New Hampshire. Slavery was an economic drag on the economy. And not only was, in some senses, that legacy continues to be a drag on the economies that had slaves. It is a long-term disaster. Cotton didn't make America rich, and cotton couldn't be produced anywhere in the world. Indeed, during the Civil War, the British bought cotton from Egypt instead of from the United States. It wasn't like we were the only source. There's this false economic idea that exports drive the economy. Yes, cotton was a big portion of exports, but exports don't drive the economy. Production, productivity, technology, innovation. That's what creates wealth. That's what drives the economy. And finally, there's this point that the people who defended slavery in the South, were anti-capitalists. Indeed, the people who defended slavery in the South feared capitalism because they knew that capitalism would drive slavery out. They knew that if Adam Smith's ideas won from an economic perspective, put aside a political, moral perspective, but just economic perspective, from the economic perspective, that slavery would lose. That slavery would be driven out. Indeed, Adam Smith was a huge anti-slavery advocate. So the number one capitalist thinker of the time, again, in economic sense, was anti-slavery capitalists, the advocates for capitalism. And Phil Magnus does a great job of bringing all this out. The advocates for capitalism were anti-slavery. The advocates against capitalism were pro-slavery. And indeed, some of the biggest pro-slavery advocates in the South considered slavery the ultimate form of socialism. Not capitalism, socialism. So slavery is a form of mercantilism. It's a product of mercantilism. Mercantilism sees the state, the so-called common good, as the end. It sees the state as guiding the economy. It's anti-free trade. It's anti-free labor. It's anti-free movement of goods, capital, and people. Capitalism liberates the world from mercantilism and from feudalism. By doing so, capitalism ends slavery. It's not an accident. It is not an accident that the country that abolishes slavery and abolishes the trade in slaves first is the United Kingdom. As it is transitioning from its mercantilist past into its capitalist future, the first thing that has to go is what? Slavery. And it's not an accident that the thriving, industrious, productive, capitalist North rejects slavery and ultimately is willing to fight a civil war in order to eliminate it completely from the American economy. And the last countries to eliminate slavery, at least in the Americas, are places like Brazil. And Argentina was a lot richer than Brazil, even though it had, I don't know if it had any slaves, but if it had slaves, a lot fewer. Brazil should have been massively rich. If slavery is so good economically, if slavery leads to capitalism, then why didn't slave economies like Haiti, slave economies like Brazil, the Caribbeans, why didn't they become capitalist? And why didn't they become rich? No, slavery is the antithesis of capitalism. Capitalism is a system of freedom. Capitalism is a system of individual rights. Capitalism does not view individuals as means to an ends, but ends in themselves. Capitalism is a system that protects the individual's right to make choices, voluntary choices for himself, good or bad choices. As long as he doesn't violate the rights of others, he is free to pursue his life based on his values, based on his ideas, his thinking. That's inconsistent with slavery, as the founding documents of the United States are inconsistent with slavery. It's why it cannot survive, and why Southern intellectuals, as Brad Thompson in his book illustrates, as Southern intellectuals turned against the Declaration of Independence and against the Constitution in their attempt to defend slavery, because they understood that the Constitution and certainly the Declaration were anti-slavery documents. It was inconsistent, and therefore civil war had to happen. So the whole project that Sam and these new historians of capitalism, they all start with Marxist premise. They all start with the idea of the evil of capitalism. And then it's just a matter of finding, and if you can't find them, making up connections, facts, relationships in order to show it. And if history is a tool, then they'll use history. The Industrial Revolution is not, and this is an important point. One of the points they make is that it's the wealth that slavery created that made possible the investment in technology and everything else during the Industrial Revolution. But it's not. Deirdre McCloskey makes this point brilliantly. And of course, Ayn Rand makes this point in an ultimate way. It is not capital that drives capitalism. It is not capital that drives capitalism. It is not capital that created the Industrial Revolution. It is not capitalism. It is not capital, sorry, that created the steam engine. It is not capital that created the factories, the increased productivity, flight, railroads, airplanes, computer chips, CRISPR. Now, capital is necessary for all of those to have the positive impact they have on our lives. But what makes all those things possible, what makes economic growth possible, what makes economic success possible, what makes capitalism possible, is the human mind, its ideas, its innovation, its ingenuity. And for those ideas to flourish, you need freedom. So it's a political institution of freedom combined with a respect for human reason, which allows then for individuals to come up with ideas, to innovate, to increase productivity, to bring those ideas into reality, to raise the capital, to hire the employees, to build the factories. But it is freedom and reason that make it all possible. Without a respect for reason in a religious society, capital would be useless. Freedom would only go so far. But it's the respect for reason combined with freedom that create wealth. And then that capital facilitates, helps that wealth creation. But without ideas, nothing happens. Without ideas and the freedom to live those ideas, the freedom to execute those ideas, nothing happens. As Deirdre calls it, it's a permissionless society. That's what we got in the early part of the 19th century, and that's what generated the amazing prosperity of capitalism. Not slavery. Slavery did the exact opposite. Slavery slowed it down. America would be so much richer today without slavery. All right, that is my spiel for today. Let's see, we got a few questions, but not many. I don't know what's going on with you guys. No, you guys are drying up in question-wise. Also, don't forget to like the show. We've got 64 likes, 127 people watching. Also, 127 people watching. You'd think some of you would have questions. So jump in. You could ask questions about anything. And the super chat is open. I will start with questions of $20 or more, and we will go from there. But, $600, we're way off of that. So please jump in. I was thinking of, all right. Okay, John Wayne, I got your question. We'll get to it. All right, let's see, $20. Ashton has a $20 question. Could you do a show critiquing Philosophy Tube's latest video called Violence and Protest? The reason why is because she is using Immanuel Kant's written books as justification for violence against large corporations. Sure, I'll look at it. I don't know that show on YouTube, but I'll look it up and I'll see if I have something intelligent to say about it, and I'll try to comment on it. All right. Jennifer asked, do you think that slavery in the South helped perpetuate racism after the Civil War, which then helped keep the South poor longer? Yes, there's no question that's true. Racism was perpetuated in the South because of their attitude towards slavery, and then because of the bloodshed of the Civil War, and because of how the North handled the post-Civil War era. I'm not an expert on that history, but the North blew it. They appeased the whites in the South, and they let them get away with Jim Crow. They let them get away with racist laws. They let them get away with limiting the ability of blacks to vote. They let them get away with institutionalizing racism. While slavery was gone, institutionalized racism remained in the South for another almost 100 years until the 1960s. And note that the South has only seen a real economic boom since the 1960s. You've seen, as racism has diminished, or at least we think has diminished in the South, and as blacks have become a more integrated part of society and become more productive, have you seen racism Have you seen the economy in the South increase and improve? But look, racism is bad for you. It's bad for you as an individual. It's bad for society. It's unproductive. Because, if all you care about productivity, if you're a good capitalist and you just want to make money, you hire the most productive people no matter what the color of their skin or their religion or their ethnic affiliation is. You just hire them based on skill, based on ability. And that produces the best results. That creates the most wealth. And that makes the world around you the best. Whereas if you discriminate against good people because of the color of their skin, you are hurting your own wealth, ability to create wealth. You're hurting your own productivity. And indeed, there was a mass migration of blacks out of the South, it was in the teens and the 20s and the 30s, to the industrial North, where there was still racism, but a lot less, and where factories were being opened, like in the auto industry, that just needed so much labor that even if they were racists, they needed the labor, so they hired the blacks. And that allowed a lot of blacks to escape poverty and escape kind of the situation in which they were living in the South. It created a black middle class and created black wealth. So the South was crippled by the legacy of slavery, and then it doubled down on that legacy by maintaining its racist attitudes for another 100 years. And that's the reason why Mississippi and Alabama and many of these states are so poor even to this day. Victor, thank you for the support. Really appreciate it. Let's see. All right, Yash asks, looking for book recommendations for postmodernism, thoughts on Stephen Hicks's book explaining postmodernism, background of finishing both Peikoff's course on history of philosophy, thanks. I mean, I think Stephen Hicks's book is good on postmodernism. I have no reason not to recommend it, so that's probably good. I'm no expert on postmodernism, so I'm not the person to ask about this. What I would do is I would sign up for the Ayn Rand Institute's course that is being taught right now on critical race theory, and it goes back to the postmoderns, and it covers that period, and it covers the Frankfurt School, and it covers the whole evolution from the Frankfurt School through postmodernism through today's critical race theory. That's probably the best source you'll get on the school of thought and the consequences of it. Okay, I've sent $10 donation on PayPal. My question is, are you aware of George Fitzgerald, I can't pronounce his name, and his book where he argues that slavery is the most basic form of socialism and is the ideal moral state? Yes, and I'm aware of him because Phil Magnus talks about him and cites him extensively in his rebuttals to the 1619 Project and his rebuttals to this whole idea of the connection between socialism and capitalism. And he shows that Fitzgerald, who was very popular at the time, is a best-selling author, very popular among pro-slavery South, was anti-free markets, considered himself a socialist before Marx, and actually viewed wage labor as more exploitative of employees than slavery was. So he considered capitalist wages as real exploitation, and he talked about that 10 years before Marx did. And he was the one who saw the connection between slavery and socialism. Under slavery, the slave owner takes care of his slaves. He feeds them, he clothes them, he hires them, he houses them. Not like that evil capitalist that just pays them a wage. So yes, George Fitzgerald is a perfect example of the pro-slavery intellectuals who hated capitalism and indeed realized that capitalism was the enemy of slavery, and that capitalism, to the extent that capitalism would be successful, it would end slavery. And to the extent that the North was becoming more and more capitalist, to that extent, the North was becoming more and more capitalist, to that extent, it would resist slavery and ultimately fight slavery. That it was so incompatible. Markets, free markets and slavery, that, you know, as free markets started to dominate, it was clear that slavery would go away. And of course, these people believed in slavery as an ideology. Well, not just economics. This was an ideology that they held and they believed in, the superiority of the white race, and to them, anything that was the enemy of slavery was their enemy. Capitalism, they identified as the enemy of slavery. I wish these so-called historians and economists would actually go back and read the pro-slavery side. Gail asks, Canada practices slavery in spades. Eastern provinces, the Fed, forces Alberta, the only producing Western province, to pay high dollars in transfer payments for equalization, distribution to have-not provinces. I mean, there's a sense in which redistribution of wealth is slavery. But I don't like using that term. I know it's used. I know I know people use it all the time. The equivocation between, I don't know, government regulations, government controls, and government redistribution of wealth as slavery. And there's a sense in which that's true. But I think it diminishes, at least to some extent, the extent of the evil of actual slavery, where somebody owns you. Somebody can control every aspect of your life, who you have sex with, who you marry, what happens to your children. Your children can be sold off. You can be hung for leaving, for disobeying. You have no rights, none, zero. So there's a degree in which you are being enslaved to your fellow man because you have to feed them. Your taxes are doing that. And you're enslaved to the bureaucrat because he's telling you how to run your business. But it's only an aspect of your life. Slavery in the South was all-encompassing. It was every single aspect of your life. And that's why I'm careful not to overuse the term slavery. And yes, there's a sense in which socialism enslaves all of society. Everybody with ability is enslaved to those without ability. And communism is total slavery, because there every aspect of your life is indeed dictated by your, quote, owners, the state. But I think a mixed economy like Canada and the United States and Scandinavia and so on, there's some elements of slavery, but there's a lot of freedom mixed in. And we should be careful not to diminish the sheer evil of the kind of slavery that exists in the South by comparing it to the pretty good lives and fairly free lives that we have today. Nowhere near where they should be. But don't think of yourself today as a slave in the same sense as a slave was in the South in the 19th century. We're nowhere near that. You're not being whipped. You're not being raped. Yes, your money is taken away from you, and that is a massive evil. But it's just not on the same scale. We're in much better shape. And maybe, to some extent, that makes it less urgent to change, and people don't see it because they're slowly boiled. It's like the frog in the boiling water. It's slow burn. It's slow, right? All right. Okay, I've got four questions, and that'll be it. Ashton says, Yaron, I know this is only $5, but you are an inspiration to many. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you, Ashton. Really appreciate that. 3 more questions. Where's Michael? He's absent today. Just he asks more questions typically than what you've all asked together combined. So you can use the Super Chat to ask questions. You can use the Super Chat to support the show. If you support what I do, if you appreciate it, value for value, the Super Chat is a great way right now to support the Yaron Brook Show and to support what we do and to support the agenda and support these shows and, bringing reason and rationality and capitalism to the masses. Enrique asks, the claim I've seen that chattel slavery is a unique kind of slavery based on property in the United States, different and worse from slavery outside the West. Comment. I don't know if you've ever watched, read the story of Spartacus. Was the kind of slavery that Spartacus endured better than the slavery that exists now? Were the slaves to the Ottomans, on the Ottoman boats who had to row and do all that, was that significantly different than chattel slavery in the United States or in the Caribbeans? That different? Are the slaves in Egypt who had to build the pyramids and the way they were treated significantly different? Yeah, there probably was a difference in the sense that in Egypt, they were owned by the state. They were owned by the king. There wasn't the sense of private property. But in Rome, slaves served a master. They served a particular person, a particular household. I guess some were enslaved in the army. In the Ottomans, they were slaves of not specific individuals. See, yes, I'm not an expert on slavery, but there are differences. But are those differences essential? The essential characteristic of slavery is you can't control your life. You don't make decisions for yourself. You are completely at the whim of your, quote, owner. You're completely at the whim of the people who tell you what to do. And if they can inflict whatever pain, whatever physical force, whatever coercion they want on you. And that there's no limit to their coercive power over you. And in that sense, I don't think there's any difference between different forms of slavery. Yes, I think the difference is that in the West, slavery was slavery to an individual. I don't know, in the Arab world, it probably was like that too. You probably slave to a sheik, to a particular sheik, but it was more to the leadership, to the state, to the authorities than it was to particular individuals as much. And that's because the West had this concept of private property and it applied it to individuals, and Rome didn't have quite that concept, and neither did other countries like Arab countries or other African countries that have slavery or Eastern countries that had slavery. They viewed it differently. Tazy, thank you. I appreciate the support. Richard, what wants the US TSA to search airline passengers and seize items? Nothing. Not fear. Political power. They have guns. We don't. Or we're not willing to use them. They are. Nothing warrants the TSA from doing that. The excuse is terrorism. The excuse is they're trying to protect you. The excuse is they have to violate your rights in a little bit of way in order to ultimately save you and protect you. That's the excuse. That's not a moral or legal warrant. There should be no TSA. The government has no business searching your stuff. The government should not be at airports. Now, airports have a right to search your stuff. Airports can establish security. Airlines can establish security. They can say, you want to go on our plane? We have to search your stuff before you go on our plane. Airlines can do it. Airports can do it. Private individuals can do it because it's their private property. But the government, having one institution with one standard, with government employees who are cops, who can then seize you and seize your materials, they have no warrant to do it. They have no justification to do it. It is completely a part of this hysteria around it's the same thing with COVID. What gives them warrant to lock you up, to have lockdowns? What gives them warrant for the government to mandate masks or to mandate vaccines or to mandate anything? We give them, in a sense, that mandate because we cower before them. RDF says, love this subject. There's so much misinformation about slavery and Jim Crow. Triple C, thank you. I really appreciate the support. Todd, $100, thank you. That's really great. No one in the U.S. today is legally a slave. I agree completely. Nobody in the U.S. today is legally a slave. There are parts of what you do where you are, you know, that look like slavery, but you are not a slave. For example, you can retire, you can go on strike, you can leave, slaves can't do that. Slaves cannot do that. All right, we are halfway to the $600. Todd's contribution really helped us get halfway there, but we're going to need a lot more Todds to get us there, and we're going to need it fairly quickly. All right, because I only have 2 more questions before we're done for the night. Ashton asks, do you think it's possible to be an objectivist while also following the philosophy of Buddhism? No, I don't. I mean, I really don't. The philosophy of Buddhism is opposed to the metaphysics and the epistemology and the ethics of objectivism. To the extent that I have any understanding of the philosophy of Buddhism, it does not hold to the objectivist axioms of existence exists and you know, consciousness and identification, and you know, the idea that A is A and the consciousness is function of consciousness is to identify existence. It doesn't hold any of that. Metaphysical reality is not the primary. Consciousness is a primary. Buddhism, I think, to a large extent, is a philosophy of the primacy of consciousness, not the primacy of existence. I don't think Buddhism is about hierarchy of values and pursuing your values and being successful and pushing yourself and being ambitious, and it's a passive philosophy. It's why most Buddhist countries never really create wealth, and certainly not while they were dominated by Buddhism, because it's a passive philosophy. It's not about go for it. It's not about change the world. It's not about change your world. Make your world the best that it can be. Because it doesn't believe that this world is meaningful and that the material world is important. At least that's my understanding. Again, I might have a flawed understanding of Buddhism. It doesn't have a strong focus on reason. Indeed, quite the contrary. Reason limits you, restrains you, constrains you. So no, I think Buddhism is very much an antithesis of objectivism. All right, Andrew, respectfully disagree that intellectuals like Sam Harris are motivated to be anti-free will. Most are emotional repressors and altruists. How often do you think they are not doing what they think they should be doing? Okay, let me try to understand what it is you're respectfully disagreeing with, because I'm not sure. That intellectuals like Sam Harris are not motivated to be anti-free will. Oh, in terms of their motivation. I see. So you think they're emotional repressors and altruists, and then they know they should be doing certain things, and they're not doing it. So they rationalize it by saying, what choice did I have? Maybe that's the psychology. Maybe. I see your point. It makes sense. I don't know that it makes sense for intellectuals like Sam Harris. I'm trying to think about how Sam Harris comes to his ideas, right? He comes to them through meditation, through LSD, and through, I think, rationalism, through an approach to science, which is rationalistic, and materialism. Part of what motivates Sam Harris is to, at every opportunity, negate the possibility of something that is not material, because in his view, if there's something that's not material, then you open up the world to God. Yeah, maybe it's all connected, and maybe there's an aspect of this that also has to do with him trying to justify his own lack of action consistent with his own altruistic beliefs. And that's what free will provides him with an excuse for that. I'll have to think about it. And again, I'm not sure I can completely explain Sam Harris, right? I mean, only Sam Harris, in a sense, can explain Sam Harris. I'm not in his mind, but it certainly could be that's part of it. Ronnie asks, why do you think these historians intentionally try to belittle capitalism, which ties to slavery, rather than speak about positives of their economic ideas? Well, because I don't think they necessarily have positive economic ideas, right? They are confronted with a world where capitalism has been a massive success. They're confronted with a world in which, capitalism has allowed people to rise up from poverty. And Marx was, at least to some extent, honest about that, where he said, yeah, capitalism does that. But Marx, of course, wasn't honest, and he couldn't see the real source of it, which is the human mind. He thought capitalism did it because it was a more efficient way of distributing manual labor. That is, it was a more efficient way to exploit manual labor than was mercantilism, or I don't even think he thought it was a mercantilism, but feudalism. But look, part of their agenda is not necessarily to offer any particular positive theory, because what is their positive theory? It's socialism. Socialism is scary to Americans. Americans don't think they want socialism. There's a lot of counter-arguments to socialism. So before they advocate for their utopian idea, their ultimate, they want to undermine the existing, what they believe is the existing system. They want to undermine the supposedly the supposed success of capitalism. They want to show that it couldn't have happened without slavery, or they want to show it can't happen without exploiting American Indians, or they can't happen without exploiting, natural resources, without destroying the environment. They want at all costs to undermine capitalism, so that then they can say, see, capitalism's failed. Now we need an alternative. Here's what we propose. Of course, if they propose something positive, they also open themselves up to criticism. Todd, thank you. Another $100 from Todd to try to push us up towards the $600. I really appreciate that, Todd. Come on, folks. You're here for ideas, value for value. Put up a few bucks for what Yaron gives you. Thank you, Todd. I really appreciate that. I was going to say something. Yes, one of the big flaws in this argument about all the capital that supposedly cotton slave trade produced, which is, again, complete BS, right? That the capital that went into slavery had alternative uses. And it was not used for those alternative uses. It was used for slavery. And there's no reason to believe that it generated higher profitability than it would have in alternative uses. But one of the problems with that is, slavery created all this capital that was then invested. Think about Spain and Portugal, who both had slavery and had unbelievable natural resources, much more important, much more significant natural resources than the English and the Americans did. Their natural resources were gold and silver mines extracted from South America mines and brought to Europe. And yet they didn't become richer. They didn't get capitalism. They had capital. And yet they lost it all. And they became poorer. Why? Because they didn't use that capital to produce. They didn't use that capital to innovate. They didn't use that capital to build any kind of value creation. They spent it. And the capital all flowed to those parts of Europe that were producing, were creating. Primarily Holland, initially Holland, which was the wealthiest place in Europe, and England, which even in the pre-industrial revolution there was some already commercial activity going on. And of course, once the 18th century hit, all the money flowed to England, not because all the capital flowed to England. Why? Because there were ideas there. Because there was innovation going on there. There was production going on there. None of it stayed in Spain. Even though Spain had natural resources. Spain had capital. Spain had slavery. Right. Ashton says, would you say the Third Reich's economy leaned towards a more capitalist or socialist structure? Well, socialist. I mean, technically fascist. But fascism, if you will, is a form of socialism. It was a controlled economy. It was an economy controlled by the state, giving property owners the illusion of private property, but where the state dictated to businesses what they produce, how much they produce, where they produce. And indeed, Germany, for a little while, had a better economy post-1930s, but it was ready. Its economy was improving in the early 1930s when Hitler was taking over. Hyperinflation was long dead, and the economy was significantly improving even without Hitler. And yes, for a while, the German economy did okay, but it could not sustain itself because it was a completely centrally planned economy. It was much more socialist than capitalist, and that's the meaning of fascism. Fascism is a centrally controlled economy where people have the illusion of private property, but where the state controls everything. All right, guys, we're $500, so we're only $100 short of a $600 goal. You know, it would be great if we made it and got out of this funk, which it lasted only last show and maybe at the beginning of this show. But let's see if we can get 5 $20 questions and get the 600 out of the way. That'll be fantastic. Okay, Tazy asks, question, do you think 2022 will be a slow burn start to life and economy worldwide? If so, will there soon be a new roaring 20s? No, I mean, I don't think there's going to be a roaring 20s. I don't see where the roaring 20s comes from. We have a world coming out of COVID that is more regulated, more controlled, more risk averse, in other words, more fearful. We have inflation. We have inflation in our midst, and we have ever-growing government and massive government debt across the West. So I don't see where the roaring 20s were real. They were a consequence of dramatic increases in production, real freedom. So the economy was freed up. This is before FDR. This is before the American New Deal. American capitalism, free enterprise is hitting on all cylinders. Yes, we've come out of a war, but Wilson is out of office. We've got Coolidge now, and Coolidge is a much more pro-markets president. And while the Fed makes a lot of mistakes during the 20s, and you could argue there was some monetary inflation in the 20s, overall, the 20s boomed because of freedom. The 20s boomed because of a massive amounts of production. I mean, you might see an increase in hedonism in 2022. All right, Todd is just God for it and finished. Thank you, Todd. So we're at 600 because of Todd. But Todd made up half of it, guys. Half of it today was just Todd. So thank you, Todd. Really appreciate it. Really, really appreciate it. And I'll take it as a compliment, value for value. I'll take it as I've produced that amount of value today. And Alex is adding some whipped cream on the top. No, I just don't see. I don't see the roaring 20s. I don't see that young people have that positive 20s attitude, that joie de vivre, the love of life, the short skirts, the music, the dancing, just wealth creation, hard work, people coming out of poverty in large numbers in the West. Now, maybe in the East, maybe you'll see that in Asia, maybe, but Asia also, in China at least, is becoming more oppressive. South Korea is becoming more oppressive. So Hong Kong is gone. So I don't know. Don't see it. All right, Alex asks, I hear from leftists nowadays that services funded by taxes is net the same for most people paying out of pocket for them. Oddly enough, what could make the same economic argument for slavery, food, healthcare, housing, etc. Yeah. I mean, that's such nonsense. I mean, everybody knows that, I don't know, if you had the government committee designing an iPhone like this, it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't be anywhere like that. We all know that. Everybody knows that. Even the leftists know that. Why do they think that a market wouldn't provide services better, cheaper, more efficiently, more effectively? Why do they think the government is doing a good job of providing services? Central planning doesn't work. Planning by committee doesn't work. John asks, does it help that your channel to engage popular leftist intellectuals like Sam Seder, Dave Pakman, Hassan Pica? I don't know Hassan Pica. If so, do you plan on engaging them sometime in the near future, giving extra because I missed some months in the past? Thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the $50. That's great. Yes, I think there is value. I think that by engaging them, we bring new people to the channel, expose the ideas. I've picked up a lot of followers from my debates with Vosh, from my debates with Sam Seder and others, Pakman in particular. So, I intend to do it. It's difficult for, my preference is for me to be invited on their shows, or for ideally third parties to invite me and them to debate properly rather than just have a yelling match somewhere. So ideally what I would have is, universities or any kind of debating societies or any debate clubs online invite me, and let's say Dave Pakman invite me and Sam Seder to debate on their platform. That would be the ideal. That would be the way in which I think we would get the most leverage out of those kind of debates, those kind of interactions. But part of the way I engage with them is by commenting on their videos, and then people on their side come to see what I'm saying on their videos, and they get exposed. So that's also good. Frank asks, isn't slavery the purchase plus sale of stolen property? Also, can there be a class action suit against the southern state for reparations? No, I don't think it's stolen property, because who's the owner? You don't own yourself. There's no meaning to the idea of owning yourself. Self comes before ownership. So you are you. And then you own stuff. But that stuff is outside of you. Now, there's a sense in which you could, a metaphorical sense in which you could say you own yourself, but not literal. It's not property. You are not property. You're not your property. And property rights are not the foundation. That's Rothbard's view. Ayn Rand does not view property rights as the foundation of rights and the essential starting points of rights. Life is the foundation, and property rights are in a sense, derivative, are a corollary to the right to life. In order to live, you must have property. In other words, you must be able to earn property. You must be able to produce. That's a requirement of human life. And it's your right to your life that creates, in a sense, a right to property, not the other way around. Can there be a class action suit against the southern states for reparations? Probably not. You can have a class action suit against the government for enforcing government policy. And if you could, it should have been done right after the Civil War. It can't be done today. You can't have the heirs do it. You'd have had to have people who lived under slavery do it. But it's not clear to me that you can sue a state for things that it did in its role as a state, in a sense that were legitimized by its constitution and its laws. I mean, you can't sue the government today to get back your taxes. It wouldn't make any sense. That's the law. It's a shitty law. We should overturn it and get beyond it. Ashton, thank you. Wow, now we're really rocking. Ashton for $99.99 writes, I just wanted to say I'm a new objectivist, and I just finished the Fountainhead today, and I'm going to start Atlas Shrugged tomorrow. Wow, you're so lucky. I am so jealous because you get to read Atlas Shrugged for the first time. Wow. And I assume you love the Fountainhead. I love the Fountainhead. Thank you for all that you do, and please remember to watch Philosophy Tube's latest video. I want your opinion on it. Yeah, I wrote it down, so it's definitely on my list. All right. Alex Miner says, quote, "We tried socialism for the benefit of black people in America. It was called slavery. Is that a good headline?" No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think people will understand it. I think it just caused people to be upset. Now, maybe that's your goal. But if you want to have a dialogue, it's not helpful. Deal with socialism, deal with slavery. There's no point in making socialism about slavery. There's so many things you have to say about the evils of socialism, why it's wrong, and make that connection. That could be the final point you make, but you're not going to start off a headline, a conversation with that. It's just going to piss people off. Jackson Ford writes, what do you say that the tech exodus in China is a sign that its disregard for individuals will ultimately be the downfall and prevent it from growing into a serious threat to American hegemony? I've been saying this for 5 years. Thank you, Jackson. I literally been saying that for 5 years. Innovation, and therefore economic growth, capitalism, are inconsistent with authoritarianism, are inconsistent with the attempt to control the mind and the attempt to control the action of individuals. Therefore, we have nothing to fear from China because China is self-imploding. It will self-implode the more it tries to control. And people are going to leave China. I mean, if the United States was smart, if there was an iota of intelligence among politicians in the United States, we would say to Chinese entrepreneurs, Chinese engineers, Chinese scientists, come to the US. We'll give you a green card on the spot. Just show up. Get on a plane. Come to the US. We'll stamp your passport with a green card as soon as you land. We'll take as many Chinese as we can. Look how productive they are. But they'll never do that. I mean, the Republicans would be apoplectic, and the Democrats don't want it either. I mean, these are high-paying American jobs they would replace. Tucker Carlson would go nuts. And yet, we would benefit enormously from the brain drain that we would be instigating in China. They don't want to stay there given the growing authoritarianism. The best people would leave. The best people would come here. If only they had an ounce of intelligence, and an ounce of moral courage, or an ounce of morality in Washington, D.C. All right, Alex asks, Chinese government will not torture and kill their families. There are lots of Chinese engineers, scientists, academics in the United States today. There are a lot of Chinese in Silicon Valley. So don't make the Chinese government, I mean, they're monstrous enough without you exaggerating. It's unnecessary to exaggerate. It's bad enough. Alex asks, in modern-day Morocco, if you are moderately middle class, you have servants. They cook, drive, nanny, clean, but can't travel without permission. Yeah, I mean, you're the same in a lot of countries where there is, I mean, you have servants in South Africa, you have servants, the wealthy, you have servants I think in a lot of African countries, you have servants in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, you have servants in some South American countries. I mean, if they can't travel without permission, that's borderline. That's borderline, and that's ugly and horrible. Servants are fine as long as it's truly voluntary. But it wasn't truly voluntary under apartheid. So that's why apartheid had to go, and that's why I'm sure there are laws about these things in Morocco that are anti-freedom, anti-capitalism. Brady asks, which one of the economic drags, slavery or the administrative, which is more of an economic drag, slavery or the administrative state? Just from a purely economics perspective. It's hard to tell because, slavery sucked up a lot of capital. As I said, there were alternative use for that capital. So a lot of capital was invested in things that, in a free market, it would have been invested elsewhere, better, more effectively. That labor would have been engaged in productive activity, not in slave work, which would have been better. It's really hard to tell. It's really hard to tell. Probably the administrative state, but it's not clear-cut. It's not clear-cut in terms of pure economic drag. Obviously, morally, slavery is much worse. Victor Johnson. This is completely off topic and intellectual, but did Ayn Rand ever respond to Gödel's theorem, which uses logic to prove logic has limits? There are truths that cannot be logically proven. No, she didn't, but I think Harry Binswanger did. So I think Harry has an answer to Gödel's theorem. It's how you interpret what Gödel says. I don't know enough about Gödel's theorem to argue this, but logic does not have limits in the sense that people interpret Gödel to mean. There are truths that cannot be logically proven in a sense that evidence of our senses, the things that we see, are true. We can't prove it logically because it's axiomatic. A is A. Existence exists are axiomatic and are not proven by logic. So there's a lot there, but that's really a question for an epistemologist, somebody like Harry Binswanger. If I have him on again, Victor, you should join the call and ask him that question. It would be a good, perfect question for Harry. All right, we are at $800. Wow. An hour ago, I did not think we were going to make it. Half an hour ago, I didn't think we were going to make it. So, wow. You guys, thank you. You guys did great. Thank you, Ashton in particular, John, and more than anybody else, Todd. Todd, I think, and Ashton brought home the most bucks to make the 800 work. So thank you to both of you. All right, we will be back on Thursday, where we'll be taking on Tucker Carlson, and Tucker Carlson's bizarre, strange, weird ideas about population and population growth. I just don't know where he gets it from. It's just so bizarre and weird. It's more bizarre and weird in some senses than the left. But plus, Tucker Carlson should know better. He used to be kind of a free market guy. But anyway, I'll see you all on Thursday. Thanks for joining me today. We'll have a show on Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday. Have a great rest of your week. Oh, don't forget. Those of you who do not yet support the show, you can do it on a monthly basis, which is really, really valuable to me, because then I can plan ahead. That's how, I can do the things that I do. I'm doing a lot of interviews right now. Those interviews are going to result in a real growth. If you value the growth of this program, then you need to find a way to financially support the program. The best way to do that is monthly. YaronBrookShow.com/support, Patreon, Subscribe Star, or local